Millionaire pays Maid to have his child, shocked when the baby looks just like him. In this jaw-dropping story, a millionaire's decision to expand his family takes an unexpected turn. Driven by his desire to have a child, he decides to bypass traditional routes and pays his maid to be the surrogate. If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press 1. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories.
Jacob Harris had everything. His mansion towered over the city, filled with luxury most people could only dream of. Yet, despite his wealth, he spent most days alone, his life as empty as the echoing halls of his home. That morning, as he sat by his office window overlooking the sprawling estate, one thought haunted him. What's the point of it all if there's no one to share it with? Jacob had no family, no heir, and no one he trusted. The weight of his isolation grew heavier each day, driving him to find a solution, one that wouldn't involve the complications he had tried so hard to avoid. As these thoughts consumed him, the sound of footsteps caught his attention. He glanced out and saw Emily Grace, the young maid he barely noticed most days. She was cleaning the ornate chandelier in the dining room, moving with focus and care. Jacob's gaze lingered longer than he intended. There was something about her quiet determination, her ability to work without complaint, that intrigued him. She was everything his world wasn't: simple, grounded, and untouched by greed. As Jacob watched her, an idea began to form. It was unconventional, even cold, but it made perfect sense. Emily could be the answer. She was young, healthy, and most importantly, disconnected from the social circles he despised. If he approached her the right way, he could offer her an opportunity that would solve his problem, and maybe even change her life. But as the thought settled in his mind, Jacob knew one thing for sure. If she said yes, nothing in his life, or hers, would ever be the same. Jacob couldn't let go of the idea. As days passed, it only grew stronger. He was a man who thrived on solutions, direct, efficient, and calculated. This was no different. For years, he had avoided forming emotional connections, viewing relationships as distractions at best and liabilities at worst. But now, his isolation was suffocating. Still, he hesitated. Proposing something so personal to someone like Emily, who barely knew him, was risky. Would she see it as an insult? A desperate act? Or worse, would she say yes and resent him forever? His thoughts churned endlessly, but his determination to act outweighed his doubts. After all, Jacob Miller never backed down from a plan. Emily had no idea that Jacob's watchful gaze had shifted toward her. For her, the mansion was simply a job, her last hope to keep her life afloat. Every paycheck went toward her mother's growing medical bills. Days turned into nights spent at the hospital, watching machines breathe life into the only family she had left. She had long accepted that dreams of school, travel, or even a simple day of peace were luxuries she couldn't afford. The only thing that mattered was her mother. But each month, the bills piled higher and the clock ticked louder. That evening, as Emily finished cleaning the grand staircase, Jacob's voice startled her. "Emily, come to my office. I need to speak with you." She froze, her heart sinking. Jacob rarely spoke to the staff directly, let alone requested a private meeting. What had she done wrong? Did he think she had broken something? Stolen something? Her mind raced as she followed him down the hall, her footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of anxiety. The office was intimidating. Shelves stacked with leather-bound books towered over a massive mahogany desk. Jacob sat behind it, his posture stiff, his hands clasped tightly. "Sit," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. Emily obeyed, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. The room's grandeur made her feel small, as if she didn't belong here, didn't deserve to breathe the same air. Jacob took a deep breath and leaned forward. "I'll get straight to the point." Emily braced herself, her mind flashing to worst-case scenarios. "I want you to have my child." The words hung in the air, sharp and surreal. Emily blinked, convinced she had misheard. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want you to have my child," Jacob repeated, his tone calm, as though he were discussing a business deal. "It will be done through artificial insemination. No physical involvement. After the birth, you'll leave the baby with me and be compensated handsomely." Emily's jaw dropped. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. "Why me?" she finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. Jacob leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Because you're trustworthy, discreet, and unattached. You need the money, and I need an heir. It's a simple arrangement." Simple? The word echoed in Emily's mind. Nothing about this felt simple. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising. "I am," Jacob replied, his tone unyielding. "I'm offering you enough money to change your life, to solve the problems I know you're facing." Emily's heart pounded. Her mother's face flashed in her mind. The doctors had warned her, without surgery, time was running out. She had tried everything, begged everyone, but the amount they needed was impossible. And now, here was Jacob, offering a solution, a lifeline. But at what cost? I need time to think about this," she stammered, rising shakily to her feet. "Take all the time you need," Jacob said, his voice softer now. "But understand, this offer won't stay on the table forever." That night, Emily sat on her bed, staring at an old photograph of her mother. In it, they were both smiling, carefree. It felt like a lifetime ago. Tears blurred her vision as Jacob's words replayed in her mind. Enough money to change your life. Could she really do this? Agree to something so cold, so transactional? She wasn't just a piece of Jacob's puzzle. She was a person. But her mother's life hung in the balance, and every passing day pushed them closer to the edge. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was the clinic. "Miss Grace," the receptionist said gently, "we're calling to remind you that the surgery must be scheduled soon. Without it, I'm afraid there's not much we can do." Emily thanked her and hung up, her hands trembling. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, suffocating her. If she said no, she might lose her mother forever. If she said yes, she might lose herself. As the sun rose the next morning, Emily made her way back to Jacob's office. Her mind was a storm, but one thought cut through the chaos. She couldn't let her mother die. Jacob looked up as she entered. "Have you decided?" he asked, his voice steady but expectant. Emily met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mix of determination and resignation. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "But I need to know you'll keep your promises." "You have my word," Jacob replied, extending a hand. Emily hesitated, then shook it. Her life would never be the same. The papers were ready the next morning. Jacob's lawyer had been efficient, as always. The contract was clinical, with no room for ambiguity. Every detail was outlined: the terms of the procedure, Emily's responsibilities during the pregnancy, and, most importantly, the agreement that the child would belong solely to Jacob once born. It was a binding, emotionless document. Emily sat across from Jacob in the office, the contract spread out before her. She scanned the pages, her stomach twisting at the coldness of the words. Every clause felt like a reminder of the lines she was crossing. "Take your time," Jacob said, his voice calm but detached. He sat with his arms folded, his expression unreadable. Emily hesitated, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the pen. This feels so final," she murmured, not looking up. "It's meant to be," Jacob replied bluntly. "I want to ensure that everything is clear for both of us. No confusion, no misunderstandings." Her chest tightened. She wasn't sure if it was his words or the weight of her decision that felt heavier. But as her mind flashed to the hospital bills and the urgent surgery her mother needed, she knew she couldn't afford to hesitate. With a shaky breath, she picked up the pen and signed her name at the bottom of the document. Jacob leaned forward, taking the contract and placing it neatly into a folder. "It's done," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We'll begin the process immediately." The following week, Emily sat in a sterile white room at a private clinic. The doctor explained the artificial insemination procedure in calm, clinical tones, while Jacob sat silently beside her. His presence was disconcerting, not because he spoke much, he didn't, but because his watchful gaze felt so deliberate. "Everything is set," the doctor said, breaking the silence. "The procedure should be straightforward." Emily nodded, though her heart felt anything but steady. Jacob remained still, his face giving nothing away. The process itself was quick and impersonal, leaving Emily feeling like just another number on a chart. When it was over, Jacob thanked the doctor and helped Emily to her feet. "You did well," he said as they left, his tone neutral, as though she had completed a task. Weeks passed before Emily received the news. The insemination had been successful. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. The life growing inside her was no longer an abstract concept. It was real, real enough to bring her both joy and fear. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, her hand resting on her stomach. What would it mean to carry a child she would never call her own? And what kind of man was Jacob, the father of this baby? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. Jacob stood there, his posture as formal as ever. "I've arranged for you to move into the mansion," he said without preamble. "It will be easier to monitor your health, and you'll have access to better care." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Move in? Isn't that a bit much?" "It's practical," Jacob replied. "I want to ensure everything goes smoothly. Besides, you'll have your own space. You won't be disturbed." She wanted to argue but couldn't find the strength. Deep down, she knew he was right. The cramped apartment she shared with her mother wasn't ideal for a pregnancy, and she couldn't risk any complications. "Fine," she said quietly. "I'll move in." The mansion felt even larger and colder now that Emily was living there full-time. Jacob had assigned her a suite on the east wing, far from the rooms he occupied. The space was beautiful, with its high ceilings and elegant furnishings, but it felt like a gilded cage. Days turned into weeks as Emily adjusted to her new reality. Her routines were carefully monitored by Jacob, who insisted on accompanying her to every doctor's appointment. His concern seemed practical rather than personal, but it was there nonetheless. "Have you eaten today?" he asked one afternoon as she sat on the porch, staring blankly at the garden. Emily looked up, startled by the question. "Yes," she said hesitantly. "Why?" "You seem tired," he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "If there's anything you need, let me know." His words caught her off guard. They weren't warm, but they weren't cold either. For a moment, she saw a glimpse of something beneath his carefully constructed exterior, something almost human. One particularly warm morning, Emily decided to organize her suite, hoping the activity would distract her from the unease that constantly lingered. She had been working for hours when a sudden wave of dizziness hit her. She stumbled, clutching the edge of a chair for support. Moments later, Jacob appeared in the doorway, his face uncharacteristically tense. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Nothing," Emily said quickly, brushing him off. "I just stood up too fast." Jacob frowned, stepping closer. "You're not supposed to overexert yourself," he said firmly. The doctor was clear about that. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice wavered. Jacob's jaw tightened. "This isn't about you anymore, Emily. It's about the baby. If you won't take care of yourself for your own sake, then do it for them." His words stung, but they also struck a chord. Emily nodded reluctantly, and Jacob's expression softened slightly. "If you need help with anything, just ask," he said before leaving the room. That night, Emily lay awake, replaying the encounter in her mind. Jacob's concern, though stern, had felt genuine. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, a side she wasn't sure how to handle. Their relationship began to shift in small, subtle ways. Jacob started checking in on her more frequently, asking questions about how she was feeling and whether she needed anything. His gestures were never overly warm, but they carried an undertone of sincerity that made Emily question everything she thought she knew about him. One evening, as they sat in the garden after dinner, Jacob surprised her by bringing a small gift, a journal. "For the baby," he said simply. "You can write down your thoughts, or anything you want to remember." Emily stared at the journal, her heart aching with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "Thank you," she said softly, her fingers brushing the leather cover. Jacob nodded, his gaze distant. "I thought it might help." Jacob had always prided himself on being a man of action, but when it came to preparing for fatherhood, he found himself at a loss. One evening, he stood in the nursery, staring down at a pile of unassembled crib parts. The instructions might as well have been written in another language. Emily, passing by with a laundry basket, paused in the doorway. "Need some help?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Jacob straightened, clearing his throat. "No, I've got it under control." She smirked, setting the basket down. "But that's why you're holding the manual upside down." He glanced at the booklet in his hands, flipping it quickly. "It's a tactical approach," he muttered. Unable to resist, Emily stepped into the room. "Scoot over. Let's do it together." For the next hour, they worked side by side, laughing at Jacob's clumsy attempts to follow her directions. At one point, he dropped a bolt, and Emily leaned down to retrieve it, her growing belly making the movement awkward. "Careful," Jacob said, his voice soft with concern. "You shouldn't strain yourself." "I'm fine," she replied, but the way he hovered nearby, ready to catch her, warmed her heart. When they finally finished assembling the crib, Jacob stepped back to admire their handiwork. "Not bad for a first try," he said, a rare grin breaking through his usual stoicism. Emily smiled. "See? You're already figuring out this whole dad thing." Another evening, Emily found Jacob sitting in the conservatory, a book in his hands. She moved closer, curious. "What are you reading?" He held up the cover. It was a parenting guide, the kind with cheerful illustrations of babies and their overly enthusiastic parents. "I didn't take you for the how-to book type," Emily teased, sitting beside him. He shrugged. "I like to be prepared." Emily glanced at the page he had open. It was about swaddling techniques. "You know, the nurses will show you how to do that at the hospital." "Still," he said, not looking up from the book. "It doesn't hurt to practice." She watched him for a moment, a mix of admiration and tenderness swelling in her chest. Jacob Miller, the man who once approached everything with cold precision, was now studying how to hold a baby. The thought made her smile. "You're going to be a great dad," she said softly. He finally looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I hope so." "You will," she reassured him. "Because you care. That's all that matters." As weeks turned into months, Emily's pregnancy progressed, and so did the subtle shifts in her relationship with Jacob. The walls of the mansion, once cold and imposing, began to feel less like a prison and more like a place of unexpected refuge. One crisp morning, Emily stood on the balcony overlooking the sprawling gardens. The autumn leaves painted the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from the chill, but from the overwhelming mix of emotions swirling inside her. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" Jacob's voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find him standing a few feet away, his gaze not on the scenery but on her. "It is," she agreed softly. "I never get tired of it." Jacob stepped closer, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. "I thought you might like to join me for breakfast in the conservatory," he said. "The sunlight is particularly nice there this time of year." Emily hesitated. Sharing meals wasn't part of their routine. Their interactions were usually limited to discussions about appointments or her well-being. "Sure," she replied after a moment. "That sounds nice." The conservatory was a glass haven filled with exotic plants and bathed in warm light. A small table was set with an array of fruits, pastries, and tea. Emily couldn't help but smile at the sight. "I didn't realize you enjoyed gardening," she remarked as they sat down. Jacob poured her a cup of tea. "I don't, particularly," he admitted. "But my mother did. She designed this space." Emily looked around with renewed interest. "It's lovely." "She had good taste?" He nodded, a distant look in his eyes. "She did. She passed away when I was young, but I kept the conservatory as she left it. It's one of the few places here that feels personal." There was a vulnerability in his words that caught Emily off guard. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "It must have been hard losing her." Jacob met her gaze. "There was. My father wasn't around much after that. The staff raised me more than he did." He paused as if weighing his next words. "I suppose that's part of why I approached things the way I did, with you." Emily stirred her tea, contemplating his admission. "What do you mean?" He sighed lightly. "I'm not accustomed to close relationships. Business has always been straightforward, predictable. I thought this arrangement would be the same. But it's different." She looked at him, seeing a flicker of uncertainty beneath his composed exterior. "People aren't transactions, Jacob," she said softly. "You can't control everything." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "So I've been told." They shared a quiet moment, the tension easing just enough to allow a comfortable silence. For the first time, Emily felt they were two people sharing a genuine connection, rather than just parties to a contract. As winter settled in, Emily found herself spending more time with Jacob. They began sharing dinners, discussing books, and even taking walks in the snow-covered gardens. Jacob's demeanor softened, his conversations less guarded. One evening, they sat by the fireplace in the library. The flames cast a warm glow, illuminating the rows of books that lined the walls. Emily ran her fingers over the spines of the volumes nearby. "You've read all of these?" she asked. Jacob glanced around. "Most of them. My father insisted I be well-read. It was one of the few things we agreed on." She pulled a book from the shelf. "May I?" she asked. "Of course." She settled back into her chair, opening the book to a random page. As she began to read, Jacob watched her, an unreadable expression on his face. "Emily," he said after a while, his tone hesitant. She looked up. "Yes?" He seemed to grapple with his words. "I wanted to apologize for how I handled things in the beginning. I realize now that I was insensitive." She closed the book, giving him her full attention. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I appreciate that." He nodded slowly. "You've shown me a different way of looking at things." "I didn't expect that." Emily smiled gently. "People can surprise you if you let them." He held her gaze, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to shift. There was an unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the growing bond they both felt but hadn't yet named. However, not all moments were serene. As the pregnancy advanced, Emily grappled with conflicting emotions. She had agreed to give up the baby, but with each passing day, the idea became more painful. The little kicks, the heartbeat during checkups, it was all becoming so real. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the nursery that Jacob had prepared. The room was immaculate, filled with everything a newborn could need. She ran her hand over the edge of the crib, her heart aching. "You're up late?" She turned to find Jacob at the doorway, his expression soft in the dim light. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "I keep thinking about everything." He stepped into the room. "Is something bothering you?" She hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I thought I could do this, but now, I don't know. The idea of handing over the baby and walking away feels impossible." Jacob's face tightened with concern. "Emily, She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I know we had an agreement, but things have changed." "I've changed." He approached her cautiously. "I never wanted to cause you pain." She met his gaze. "I believe that. But we can't ignore how we feel. At least, I can't." Jacob reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Neither can I," he admitted. "This was never just about an heir. Not anymore." Her heart pounded. "What are you saying?" He took a deep breath. "I'm saying that I don't want you to leave. That perhaps we could find a different path forward. Together." Emily searched his eyes, looking for any hint of insincerity but found none. "Jacob, are you sure?" He nodded. "I've never been more certain." The next day, they sat down to discuss what their future might look like. It was uncharted territory for both of them. Trust didn't come easily, and fears lingered, but they agreed to take things one step at a time. As they navigated this new chapter, external pressures began to mount. Word of Emily's presence in Jacob's life had reached the outside world, sparking rumors and unwanted attention. Reporters sought any scrap of information, and whispers circulated among Jacob's business associates. One afternoon, Jacob received a call from his lawyer. "Jacob, there's talk among the board members. They're concerned about your personal affairs affecting the company." He hung up the phone, frustration etched on his face. Emily noticed his tension. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated before answering. "There's concern about how our situation might impact my business." She frowned. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble." He shook his head. "You're not causing trouble. This is my issue to handle." Despite his words, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was a complication in his otherwise orderly life. The fear of being a burden resurfaced, and she withdrew slightly, unsure of her place. Their relationship hit a rough patch as doubts crept in. Emily wondered if Jacob would eventually resent her, while Jacob feared he might lose the progress he'd made in opening up. One evening, after a particularly strained day, Emily found Jacob in the conservatory, staring out into the night. "Jacob," she began softly. He turned, his expression weary. "I didn't hear you come in." She took a step closer. "We need to talk." He sighed, nodding. "I know." She gathered her courage. "Maybe this was a mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I should leave after the baby is born." His eyes flashed with alarm. "Don't say that. I don't want you to go." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't want to go either, but I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart." He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "Emily, my life was empty before you came into it. The business, the money, it means nothing without someone to share it with." She searched his face. "Are you sure? Because I can't bear the thought of you regretting this." He cupped her face gently. "I'm more certain of this than I've been about anything. I want us to be a family." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I want that too." They embraced, both holding on tightly as if to solidify their unspoken promise to each other. The following weeks tested both Jacob and Emily in ways they hadn't anticipated. The news of Emily's pregnancy and her connection to Jacob had spread beyond the confines of the mansion. Gossip columns speculated wildly, painting her as a gold digger and Jacob as a man spiraling into scandal. The worst blow came during a board meeting when one of Jacob's senior partners, a man he had worked with for years, expressed his doubts openly. "Jacob, this situation with the girl," the man said, not even bothering to use Emily's name, "is becoming a liability. Investors are concerned about your priorities." Jacob's jaw clenched, his usual calm slipping. "My priorities are exactly where they need to be. This doesn't affect my ability to run the company." The man leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Perception matters, Jacob. You built this empire on discipline and control. This situation doesn't project either." Jacob left the meeting with a storm brewing inside him. The idea that Emily and the child could be seen as a situation infuriated him. When he returned to the mansion, he found Emily sitting on the nursery floor, folding tiny clothes into neat piles. She looked up at him with a tired smile, but it faded when she saw the tension on his face. "Bad day?" she asked softly. He sat down beside her, running a hand through his hair. "The board thinks you're a distraction. That this is a mistake." Emily's hands froze mid-fold. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I don't belong in your world." Jacob turned to her, his expression fierce. "Don't say that. You belong here more than any of them." She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "But I don't want to make your life harder, Jacob. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything you've worked for." He reached for her hands, holding them firmly. "You're not a liability, Emily. You're my family. And I won't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Despite Jacob's determination, the pressure mounted. Rumors turned into outright hostility, with reporters camping outside the gates and photographers snapping pictures whenever Emily ventured out. One afternoon, as Emily walked through the garden, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her old neighbor. "Saw you in the papers. Stay strong." She frowned, opening a link to a tabloid headline, "Maid turned mistress, the woman behind Jacob Miller's scandal." The article was brutal, dissecting her past and implying she was using her pregnancy to secure a fortune. Emily's chest tightened as she read. Every insecurity she had ever felt came rushing back. That evening, she confronted Jacob. "This isn't working," she said, standing in his office doorway. "The press, the board, they won't stop. I don't want to ruin your life." Jacob looked up from his desk, his face unreadable. "You're not ruining my life, Emily. They are. But they won't stop unless I leave," she said, her voice breaking. "And I can't live like this. I can't raise a child in the middle of a media circus." He rose from his chair and crossed the room, his gaze intense. "Then let me fix it?" Emily shook her head. "How? You can't control the world, Jacob." "No," he admitted. "But I can show them the truth." Jacob's plan was bold and completely out of character. For years, he had avoided the spotlight, preferring to let his business successes speak for themselves. But now, he arranged a press conference at the mansion. The media gathered on the lawn, expecting a cold, calculated defense from the millionaire. Instead, they got something entirely different. Jacob stood at the podium, his hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder as she stood beside him. "I've always been a private man," he began, his voice steady. "But recent events have forced me to address the speculations surrounding my personal life. This woman," he said, gesturing to Emily, "is not a gold digger. She's not a scandal. She's the woman I love and the mother of my child." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Jacob continued. "Our relationship didn't begin conventionally, but that doesn't make it any less real. Emily has shown me what it means to care for someone beyond business or ambition. She's my family. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." Emily's heart raced as she listened. His words were unexpected, raw, and vulnerable. For the first time, she saw Jacob not as the man who had coldly proposed a contract, but as someone willing to risk everything for her. The press conference worked, silencing many critics. But the true victory was the bond it cemented between Jacob and Emily. They were no longer two people navigating a transactional arrangement. They were a team. As Emily's due date approached, the tension turned to anticipation. The nursery was ready, and Jacob had rearranged his schedule to be fully present. One night, as they sat by the fire, Jacob placed a hand on Emily's growing belly. "Do you think I'll be a good father?" he asked quietly. Emily smiled, placing her hand over his. "I think you'll be amazing. You've already proven how much you care." Jacob's gaze softened. "I never thought I'd feel this way, Emily. About you. About the baby. But now, I can't imagine life without either of you." She leaned against him, her heart full. "You've changed, Jacob. And I'm so glad you did." The night of the baby's birth was both chaotic and beautiful. Emily went into labor unexpectedly, and Jacob, usually calm under pressure, was a bundle of nerves. At the hospital, he refused to leave her side, holding her hand through every contraction. When their son was finally born, Jacob's composure shattered. Tears streamed down his face as he held the tiny, squirming bundle for the first time. "He's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Emily watched him, her own eyes filled with tears. "He's..." In that moment, the weight of everything they had endured seemed to lift. The baby wasn't just a symbol of their journey, it was a new beginning. The mansion, once a silent fortress, now hummed with life. The baby's cries echoed through the halls, followed by the soft murmurs of Emily soothing him. Jacob often found himself drawn to the nursery, his steps quickening as he neared the door. One evening he entered quietly, not wanting to disturb them. Emily was sitting in the rocking chair, the baby cradled in her arms. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "He just fell asleep," she whispered. Jacob approached, leaning over to get a closer look. The baby's tiny features were relaxed in sleep, his little hands curled into fists. Jacob reached out tentatively, brushing a finger against the baby's soft cheek. "He's amazing," Jacob said, his voice filled with awe. Emily nodded, her eyes misty. "He really is." Jacob had taken to spending his mornings with the baby. He would carry him around the garden, pointing out the flowers and talking softly, as though the infant could understand. Emily watched from the window one day, her heart swelling at the sight. Jacob, once so rigid and guarded, now carried their son with a tenderness she never expected. But life as new parents wasn't without its challenges. One night, the baby's cries woke them both. Emily started to get up, but Jacob stopped her. "Stay in bed," he said, already halfway to the door. "I'll take care of it." She smiled sleepily as she watched him disappear down the hall. Moments later, she heard his low voice murmuring a lullaby. By the time he returned, the baby was asleep in his arms. "See," he said, settling back into bed beside her. "I'm getting the hang of this." Emily laughed softly. "You're a natural." One afternoon, Emily's mother visited the mansion for the first time since the baby's birth. The older woman's health had improved significantly after her surgery, and she moved with newfound energy as she held her grandson for the first time. "He has your eyes, Emily," her mother said, tears glistening in her eyes. "And Jacob's determination." Jacob, standing nearby, chuckled. "Let's hope he's less stubborn than his parents." The room filled with laughter, the kind that felt warm and genuine. For the first time in years, Emily felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the months passed, Jacob and Emily grew into their roles as parents and partners. Their days were filled with small joys, the baby's first smile, late-night feedings shared in quiet companionship, and lazy afternoons spent as a family in the garden. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jacob turned to Emily. "You've made this house feel like a home," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "And you've made it a family?" He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the love and gratitude he felt. "I never thought I'd have this, Emily. But now I can't imagine life without it." She leaned against him, their son sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Neither can I." The months that followed were filled with joy. Jacob embraced fatherhood with a devotion Emily hadn't expected, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. The mansion, once cold and empty, now echoed with laughter and warmth. One evening, as they sat in the garden with their son, Jacob turned to Emily. "I want to ask you something," he said, reaching into his pocket. Her breath caught as he pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a delicate diamond ring. "Emily, you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've given me love, a family, and a reason to be better. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes, Jacob. 1,000 times yes." Conclusion. Their wedding was a quiet, intimate affair, held in the very garden where Jacob had proposed.